Everyone. My name is Professor Eileen Gibney. I'm Director of the UCD Institute of Food and Health, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our first public lecture series in 2024. And this is our public lecture series in food and health. So the purpose of these is to provide you with really up-to-date knowledge on topics in the area of food and health that we know of are of particular interest to the public. Tonight's lecture is on the topic of sports nutrition for adolescents, and judging by the really large number of participants that we have registered tonight, I know it's a great interest to a lot of you. So I'm going to introduce tonight's speakers, both Dr. Katy Horner and Professor Kate Pumpa. So Katy is a lecturer in sport and exercise nutrition at UCD and specialises in exercise physiology and nutrition. She gained her PhD in exercise and nutrition sciences in Australia and is a registered nutritionist in the area of sports and exercise. And she currently works as part of the AdAstra athlete support team here at UCD. Kate is an accredited sports dietitian and an accredited exercise physiologist, and has recently joined us as Professor of Sports and Exercise Physiology at UCD. She has over 15 years of experience working as a sports dietitian in professional sports, particularly in the area of rugby union and basketball. And I'm really excited to hear what they have to say today. So during the talk, if you have any questions, you can add them to the Q&A tab that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And my colleague, Professor Lorraine Brennan, will moderate the question and answer section at the end of the lecture. So we look forward to hearing any questions that you may wish to pose, and I'm delighted to welcome Kate and Katy, and I'll hand over to you both now.
Hi everyone, so thank you very much Eileen for the introduction, and thank you very much to everyone for joining this webinar with us this evening. So the topic of tonight's webinar is sports nutrition for adolescents. So where to start with sports nutrition? It's a broad topic, and this can be what people may sometimes think of when they think of sports nutrition. So firstly, thinking about supplements, then nutrition around training and competition, and lastly, everyday diet. But it really should be the other way around, and this is the evidence-based approach here to optimize nutrition for performance. Far greater improvements will be made by getting daily diet right and sports nutrition, so food intake around exercise. This is where the biggest gains in health and performance can be made. So we're going to talk through some of the evidence as well as practical recommendations regarding each of these elements of the pyramid now. And then finally, we'll consider some key issues for adolescents specifically. So before we go into the nutrition aspects, it's important to acknowledge the focus of this talk is on adolescence. These are some of the key differences in physiology between adolescents and adults that are present even in late adolescence and can impact capacity to undertake training. For example, adolescents have altered mechanisms to regulate body heat compared to adults. Overall, they've a smaller plasma volume, they've a lower concentration of sodium in the blood and a lower sweat rate. So as a result, younger athletes can be more vulnerable to heat illness associated with exercise, and it's important to ensure adequate hydration. Adolescents also have a smaller heart size and therefore a lower cardiac output. And this suggests a lower capacity for high intensity energy expenditure. During adolescence, muscles also tend to grow more so in length rather than breadth. So overall muscle mass is smaller in adolescence. And this explains why there can be a delay experienced by adolescent athletes who want to increase their muscle mass while their muscles are still lengthening. This growth, along with maturation of bones, increases overall energy requirements in adolescence. Along with these differences, we also need to consider the individual differences for each athlete when considering the best nutrition strategy. So we need to consider the goals of the individual. Are they short-term or long-term? What are the specific demands of the sport? And this will be impacted by both intensity and training, of the sport, and in turn impacted by age and school or even work demands for some adolescents. We also need to consider the energy needs of the individual, so how their overall calorie requirements, the environmental conditions, so will there be an impact of environment, for example, performing in the heat or the cold? How important are different food or liquid types? How relevant is nutrient timing for that sport? Is nutrition before, during, and after exercise relevant? And finally, the food choices and individual and preferences of the individual, which will in turn be impacted by their ability to access food. There's no point in recommending certain foods if the athlete doesn't like them or has limited access to that food. So I'll pass over now to Kate, who will discuss meeting energy requirements.
So energy requirements are one of the most important things to get right initially. And so there's a number of different ways that we can look at energy requirements of adolescent athletes. And so to start off with, many of you may have Fitbits, Apple Watches, other sorts of monitoring devices that enable you to track how many calories that you may consume, track how much energy you expend during the day. The problem with a lot of these devices is the accuracy is very variable. So they can underestimate or overestimate someone's energy expenditure anywhere between 25 to 30%. When we're looking at adolescent athletes or individuals holistically, our energy requirements are made up of different things. So we have our basal metabolic rate, which you can see in the blue graph down the bottom, the blue bar chart. Our basal metabolic rate is the energy we require to consume through food just to get out of bed and function. We then have the thermic effect of food. So when we consume meals, our metabolic rate will increase slightly. We have our non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And so this is going to be activities that you might do outside of structured exercise. It might be walking to the bus, walking around class, for example. And then we have our exercise activity thermogenesis. And in adolescent athletes or athletes in general, this is the most variable component of an athlete's energy expenditure. I want to provide you two examples now of how variable energy expenditure can be in adolescence. So in this first slide here, you'll see I have provided you with some data from one of the female basketball athletes that I used to work with. She was 17 years old and she was in a professional program. And so what I typically would tend to do when I'm trying to create a meal plan or some nutritional prescription for these athletes is assess their total energy expenditure through a research grade activity monitor. And then I get them to record their nutritional intake at the same time. And so I can get a bit of an idea of how much energy they are expending during training and daily activities, and also how that matches up. So if you have a look at the top two lines here on this slide, the blue is the energy intake from my food diary, and then the green is the total energy expenditure. Now, when I'm looking at this, the key concerns that I have with this particular athlete is if you look at Saturday, Sunday, Tuesday, then there's nearly 1,000 calories or a little bit higher deficit. So that means that particular athlete or this particular female was she was not consuming 1,000 calories less than what she actually required to meet the demands of all her training, competition, and school-based activities. So this was a female athlete. If we go to the next slide, you'll then see some examples of a male adolescent athlete, same age, but you can see here the energy expenditure is significantly higher. So the total energy expenditure in some of these instances around the 4,000 kilocalories, or in some of the female athletes, it was a little bit lower. Again, we can see some differences between the energy intake and also the energy expenditure. From my experience working with athletes, I tend to find that the majority, I should say, of the male athletes tend to be a little bit better at meeting their energy needs compared to some of the female athletes I've worked with. However, I still have had quite a number of cases where male athletes are not consuming enough food, which is termed, if they're exercising a lot, low energy availability. So low energy availability refers to the amount of energy left over and available for your bodily functions after the energy expenditure for all your training is subtracted from the energy intake from food. And I've popped a little equation that you can see here down on the bottom of the screen. So we're looking at the total energy that you're consuming from food. We're minusing the exercise energy expenditure. So that could be exercise during gym-based sessions or field-based sessions. It could be running, swimming, cycling, and that gives us our energy availability. So how much do we have left over to do all the things that our body needs to do? Now, this has been something, well, low energy availability is something that has increased in prevalence over the last few years in my role working with a range of different athletes, particularly across team sports. And these are some of the consequences that can come about from that consistent low energy availability. So I don't mean that they're just consuming a bit lower calories on a day or 2 days. I'm talking about, habitual underconsumption of food despite high training demands and therefore high energy expenditures. So some of the consequences can include some metabolic and hormonal disruptions. It decreases our metabolic rate. So one of our body's compensation mechanisms is to actually start to shut some of our physiological functions down. So our bone health starts to deteriorate. And that can lead to increased stress reactions or stress fractures in athletes, which I have found quite common in the female basketball athletes that I worked with. It can impede menstrual function as well in female athletes, which can be a real problem, particularly in adolescent athletes. It also can impair our immunity. It impairs our body's ability to use glucose, which is one of the primary fuel sources for exercise. And consequently, it can also increase our fat stores within the body. Now, this might sound a bit strange when you're consuming less calories than you're actually needing, but what the body is doing is then holding on to as much of that energy that it's getting in through food to try and have enough energy to maintain some of those bodily functions. And I have had a few examples where athletes' body fat mass has increased, and to then discover that they've actually been restricting their food intake quite a lot, and it's having the counter effect of what they're actually trying to do. And by increasing the amount of food that that particular athlete is consuming, we can actually help reduce their body fat. So I've talked a little bit about how you can measure the energy expenditure. So you can use equations, you can use activity monitors to give you a rough guide, but then you also need to be able to work out how to measure nutritional intake. And a couple of great apps that you can get freely available from app stores to monitor nutritional intake. So MyFitnessPal, Easy Diet Diary, Meal Logger, Libro, or even just a pen and a paper. And you can record how much food you're consuming, and then you can work out the calories associated with this. Now, a lot of these apps, if they are some of the better ones, such as Libro, which is an Irish-based company, and Easy Diet Diary, which is an Australian-based company, they don't enable users to edit any of the data in there. So it makes them really strong in terms of the nutrition data that they provide individuals, enables you to quite accurately calculate how much energy you are consuming. The other trick with measuring energy intake and also energy expenditure is to try and get the balance right on different days. So if your adolescent athlete has a really high training day, so perhaps they have a session in the morning, then they go to school, and maybe they have a different session in the afternoon, they need to be consuming significantly more food than if they have a day on the couch, or they perhaps just have a really light training day. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Kate. So having considered the overall energy requirements, the next aspect to consider is within that energy, which source it's best derived from. So here we're considering our macronutrients. So how much energy should come from carbohydrate, so our grains, cereals, breads, etc. Proteins, so our lean meat, fish and eggs, and fat, so things like avocados or nuts. And I'll be referring here to the most recent recommendations published for adolescent athletes. Firstly, looking at carbohydrates, these can sometimes get a bad name, but they really are a fundamental part of an athlete's diet, and this is why. So they're essential for brain function. We know that glucose is the preferred fuel source for the brain. Carbohydrates are also essential to fuel high-intensity exercise. When our stores become depleted, that's when fatigue sets in and we just can't maintain that same exercise intensity. If we're consistently training in a state of low carbohydrate availability, this can also compromise our immune function. And finally, in contrast to fat and protein, which we can only store a very limited, in contrast to fat and protein, we can only store a very limited amount of carbohydrate in the body. And this is stored in the liver and in the muscle as glycogen. And this is about 2,000 calories. But we use up these stores during high intensity exercise. So it's essential that we replace this through the diet. So how much carbohydrate should an adolescent athlete consume? These are recommendations here currently, which are actually the same as guidelines for adults. So the guidelines take into account the weight of the person and the intensity and duration of the activity. So for example, if the recommendation is 5 grams per kilo body mass per day, you multiply 5 by the person's body mass, and that gives the total amount of carbohydrate that should be consumed. So in the case of a 50 kilo athlete, that would be about 250 grams over the course of the day in this example. And as you can see here, the recommendations vary based on the activity undertaken in the day. So on a light activity day, this could be a rest day or very low intensity training day. The recommended range is quite low. Whereas when we get up to high or very high activity days, that recommended intake is nearly double. So these recommendations have been summarized by the phrase fuel for the work required, that we should adjust our daily carbohydrate intake based on the demands of the day. So there's a lot of numbers in the previous slide which are useful, but if we look at this in simpler terms, this is what it looks like. So these are examples of what an athlete's plate should look like on 2 different types of training day. On the left for a moderate training day, so you can see your grains or carbohydrates, your protein and your vegetables. And on the right, a hard training day. So more of the plate, approximately half at each meal, should be made up of carbohydrate on a hard training day. So the key message is to increase the amount of carbs at meals on hard training days. As well as this, ensuring appropriate snacks around exercise will help to automatically meet requirements. And I have some examples of snacks here. So pre-exercise, things like a sandwich, bagel, fruit juice, or banana. So you're aiming for high in carbohydrate and low in fat. During exercise then will depend on the duration and the intensity of the exercise. If it's shorter than an hour, then water is sufficient. But if it's high intensity and longer than an hour, then carbohydrate is useful. And this is where sports drinks like Glucosate Sport or a homemade version or another source of carbohydrate have a role. With regard to sports drinks, it's important to be conscious of dental health as well. So important to recognize when they are beneficial. And that's really for high intensity exercise of greater than 1 hour. Post-exercise then, we're looking at combining carbohydrate with protein to aid in recovery, which Kate will go into more detail on a bit later. So by including these snacks on exercise days, that should help to automatically adjust carbohydrate intake to meet the demands of the day. What about protein intake then as an adolescent athlete? We know protein is important for athletes for growth and repair, and adolescent athletes should generally be aiming for a higher protein intake than what's currently recommended for the general population. So similar to carbohydrate, current protein guidelines are also expressed relative to body weight. And 1.5 grams per kilo body weight per day is what's recommended for adolescent athletes. So this would equate to about 75 grams per day for a 50 kilo athlete or about 120 grams per day for an 80 kilo athlete. So again, lots of numbers, but what does this look like in practice? In general, it's recommended that we try and spread that protein intake evenly during the day, and this is why. So our bodies are constantly in this process of muscle protein synthesis, shown in green, and breakdown in red. So if we're looking to support muscle growth, what we want to do is shift towards the dashed lines. So increase synthesis in green and reduce breakdown in red. And this will mean we're in a positive protein balance and that muscle can be gained. To do this, resistance exercise is needed along with optimal energy and protein intake. And for most adolescents, that will average out at consuming a meal containing about 20 to 25 grams of protein every 3 to 5 hours. So this could be having 500 mils of milk and a handful of nuts at breakfast, a 3-egg scrambled egg at lunch, a chicken breast at dinner, and a Greek yogurt prior to bed, for example. Finally, in terms of macronutrients, it's also important that we don't neglect fat. Even though it's often thought of negatively, it is an essential part of the diet and important for performance, as it can assist with brain function, absorption of vitamins, and in reducing inflammation. Recommendations for fat intake for adolescent athletes are in line with adult recommendations and state that it should comprise about 20 to 35% of total daily intake. These are all good sources here for an athlete's diet, whereas saturated fat coming from things like biscuits, cakes, etc. should be limited to less than 10% of overall daily intake. Another final aspect of a balanced diet that's essential for athletic performance is ensuring adequate hydration. When you're in a water deficit of more than 2% of your body weight, many studies have shown that performance is impaired. And these are the mechanisms shown here. So it can decrease your plasma volume, decrease your cardiovascular function, deplete your muscle glycogen quicker, increase your body temperature, and increase your perceived exertion. And all of this will lead to impaired performance. And this seems to be a common issue for adolescent athletes. A study of adolescent athletes from several sports reported about 75% to be dehydrated, both before and after training. And a recent study published last week investigating hydration status at Munster Rugby's summer age grade programme reported similar statistics pre-exercise, meaning that training and also potentially cognitive capacity may be impaired. So a simple way of checking if you're hydrated and on a daily basis is looking at morning urine colour. It should be a pale yellow colour, as you can see here. If it's not, this indicates that you're not drinking enough. There are other ways you can use to monitor hydration status as well, but this is one of the simplest. In terms of hydration guidelines, these will be impacted by environmental conditions, but in general, for adequate hydration on a daily basis, for males over 14 years, similar to adults, they should be drinking about 2 litres per day, and for females, about 1.6 litres per day. But then with exercise, you need more. And these are the specific guidelines around exercise here. So pre-exercise, for a 50-kilo athlete, about 500 mils of fluids 3 to 4 hours before exercise, and then within the hour before exercise, about 100 to 350 mils. During exercise, then you're looking at a couple of mouthfuls every 20 minutes, and post-exercise, you're looking at replacing the fluids lost. If you're able to weigh the athlete or weigh yourself before and after exercise, or else replacing with 400 to 800 mils per hour of exercise. So putting it all together, this is what a sample day might look like for an adolescent athlete. This is for a 16-year-old boy playing several sports, cycling to and from school. So you can see breakfast, a large bowl of cereal with 2 to 3 pieces of toast and fruit, snacks throughout the day to help boost carb intake, lunch, so simple, sandwiches, yogurt, water, pre-training, banana and milk, followed by water, during training, sports drink or water, post-exercise, a sandwich with fruit plus milk, and then followed by dinner and supper. And this is from a really nice resource from Safe Food, shown at the link here, and we've the link in the resources at the end as well. So they also give sample daily plans for different scenarios, which, as I said, we've included the link at the end of the talk. So I'm going to hand over to Kate now to talk about some key micronutrients in relation to exercise.
Thanks. So now Katie has covered off all the macronutrients that you require to meet your energy demands. But there's just a couple of micronutrients I wanted to talk about in a little bit more detail that are really important for adolescent athletes. And the first two being calcium and vitamin D. As you can see on the screen here, this is when our bone mass, adolescence up until around our mid-20s, it was when our bone mineral density reaches its peak, or it's increasing significantly and reaches your peak around mid-20s. So what that means is that our bones are becoming thicker and stronger through our adolescence, right up until we reach our peak bone mass. To ensure that you have really strong bones, you need to have sufficient calcium and also vitamin D to lay down the bone tissue. So from a calcium perspective, this can be easily attained from dairy-based products such as milk, yogurts, cheese, and so forth. However, if you don't consume any dairy or animal-based products, you can also attain them from fortified-based cereals or milks, or you can go for other plant-based sources such as almonds, for example. The reason why calcium and vitamin D is so important is that if you have quite a low bone mineral density, particularly if you're an athlete who's not consuming sufficient nutrients or not consuming sufficient macronutrients and your energy intake is low, then it puts you at a much higher risk of injury, particularly in bone tissues, if you do high intensity and impact-based activity. And as I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, bone-based injuries were really prevalent in my female basketball athletes who used to spend a lot of time indoors, had low energy intake, and they typically had a low calcium intake as well, which resulted in a lot of missed training time for those particular athletes. The other part of the equation other than calcium is vitamin D, and I have a picture of the sun there because it's very important. And for these basketball athletes in Australia, being deficient in vitamin D was quite a problem considering we have a lot of sun exposure. So you can get vitamin D from a range of different foods such as oily fishes, egg yolks, red meats, liver, or it's also fortified in a lot of foods you can find here in Ireland, particularly milk-based drinks or other cereals. So consuming sufficient vitamin D and calcium is really important for your bone health, your teeth, and also your muscles. The other micronutrient I wanted to talk about briefly was iron. And the reason I picked this one out is because particularly in adolescent female athletes and also vegetarian or vegan athletes, then they are at a much higher risk of iron deficiency, particularly if they're involved in a lot of regular intensive training programs. Now, iron is really important because it transports oxygen around our body, so that enables us to do exercise. It's important for red blood cell production, is involved in a lot of the enzymes that help us release the energy from food to enable us to do exercise. And it's also really important for a healthy immune system in fighting infection. So it's making sure that you have sufficient red-based meat or even your green leafy vegetables, a great example, and co-ingesting that with something that's high in vitamin C, for example, an orange like I have shown on this screen, it can enhance your iron absorption. So if your adolescent athlete consumes a bowl of cereal, particularly whole grain cereal at breakfast time, if you could add a small glass of orange juice into that, that will enhance the bioavailability and the absorption of iron from that meal. And as I mentioned, it is particularly important for female athletes as they're going through adolescence and into their 20s. I'm now going to talk a little bit about recovery. We're moving into some of the final practical elements of the talk. So with nutrition for recovery, I'm looking at the 4 R's. So you want to refuel with carbohydrates, which Katy talked about a little bit earlier. You want to repair with protein. So that means you want to have sufficient protein within your diet and at regular intervals throughout the day to help your muscle tissue grow and repair from all the damage that is caused when you exercise. You need to rehydrate with fluids. And as Katy mentioned, weighing someone before and after exercise to identify how much weight or fluid they have lost through sweat can help guide you as to how much you need to replace. And the last R is relax. And that refers to sleep and recovery. So sleeping is one of the most important recovery agents for any athletes in conjunction with nutrition. And there are a number of nutritional interventions you can implement to enhance your sleep. For example, there's been some great research coming out of Ireland looking at kiwi fruit ingestion to enhance sleep. So 2 kiwi fruits about 60 minutes before bed of the green or gold variety can enhance your sleep quality and quantity. You can also consume other foods like tart cherries, or it could even be a milk that's high in tryptophan that will help improve your sleep quality and quantity. When I just look at some food options for recovery, this is, I guess, some practical ideas of what you may be able to include. And that can include things like a piece of bread and a couple of eggs. It could be things like a muesli bar, so portable snacks that you might be able to keep in your gym bag or in the car if you're transporting adolescents between different training sessions. It could be a homemade smoothie, and that could be fruit or dairy-based or even a soy-based smoothie. And I find them great because they give you good protein, fluid, and carbohydrate all in one. You can have things like nuts and bananas. So nuts, you're getting some good fats and protein and some carbohydrate from bananas. And yogurts, or even the high protein milk. If you have an adolescent athlete who has really large energy requirements and you're trying to meet their energy needs, then looking for some of those foods that have a little bit extra energy in it can be very advantageous. So one of probably the number one question I get as a sports dietitian, particularly from adolescents, and I must say it is particularly from male adolescents, is how do they get bigger and how do they increase their muscle mass? So the first thing is you need to be doing resistance training. So it doesn't matter how great your nutrition is, if you're not doing any weightlifting or you're not doing any of that resistance-based training or heavy training, you're not going to be able to increase your muscle size, probably to the extent that one of some of those adolescents want to. Now, throughout adolescence, you are increasing your muscle tissue in length as well as breadth. And because if we have an adolescent athlete who is weight training as well as doing other sort of metabolic conditioning or cardio-based work, and their energy requirements are quite high, then you really need to focus on having regular meals and snacks that contain protein and also a lot of energy so that you're in an energy surplus. So that means you're consuming more calories from your diet than you're expending through exercise, because building muscle takes a lot of energy. So what you can see here is a slightly different version of what Katy's shown you in a previous slide, is where the green is representing muscle protein synthesis and the red sections are looking at muscle protein breakdown. So what we want to be doing is consuming sort of 10 to 20 grams every sort of meal or snack for these adolescent athletes, and particularly around weight training, you would want to be getting around 25 grams of high quality proteins within that sort of 30-minute window post weight training to help promote muscle protein synthesis. Another great thing you can do is to have something that's higher in protein just before you go to sleep as well, because there's been some fantastic literature over the last couple of years that has shown muscle accretion or gaining lean mass overnight is achievable when you have a good amount of protein. And some of these studies, they've all been in adults, but they're looking around that 30 to 40 grams prior to going to sleep to help enhance their muscle growth. And that could be as simple as just having a milk-based smoothie. So you get that whey protein, plus you get the leucine, which is really important for your muscle protein synthesis.
So just to wrap up, I just want to draw your attention to immune function in athletes. So it can be a big issue for adolescents, is commonly getting sick or having issues with illness. So this figure here shows how risk of illness relates to training load in both recreational and elite athletes. So basically what you see here is that at moderate training load, illness risk is low. But when undertaking a high training load, that risk of illness can be increased quite substantially. So this is something to be aware of if someone is undertaking a large amount of training. But there are things that can be done. You can help your immune system by ensuring you have a balanced diet, so consuming enough energy and fruit and veg, ensuring vitamin D status is optimal. Taking a probiotic daily can also assist immune function, along with washing our hands, as is regular sleep, as Kate highlighted. So doing all of these things should help the immune system. In terms of supplements, these do have relevance in sports nutrition, but we should always take a food first approach. The Australian Institute of Sport have a very nice ABCD framework at the link here, where they categorize the evidence behind different supplements, with the A category having the greatest evidence base. However, for anyone under 18, it's important to note that none have been studied in adolescence, and therefore none are actually recommended for this age group. The only supplement recommended for adolescents is vitamin D, with the recommendations from the Department of Health at 15 micrograms per day from October to March in Ireland. So I'm going to hand back to Kate to wrap up.
Yeah, the last little things was just some practical tips to take away with you. Now that you have an overview of how much energy, macro and micronutrients that you need to be consuming. And I guess my number one practical tip for any adolescent athlete is to be organized and to have portable food options available in your gym bag, in your school bag, or in the car if you're being transported around. I think being organized is the number one thing to ensure that you have good food choices around training and also good food options throughout the day. And then you're not relying on quick fixes if you're hungry and then you need to pick something up on the go. So being organized and portable food options is number one. The next one is to make sensible food choices when you're out, or conscious food choices when you're out. So if you are at a takeaway shop, for example, looking at all your different options, and perhaps instead of going for a fried or a burger option, you might be going for something that's a little bit healthier. You need to be eating regularly. So you should not be waking up and not having any food until sort of lunchtime or afternoon. If you're serious about training and gaining and improving in your sport, you need to be eating regularly throughout the day to make sure that you have enough energy, and also to make sure that your muscle growth is you're in a positive balance, so that you're growing muscle rather than breaking a lot of muscle down. The other thing is to always keep a water bottle with you. Even if it's not hot, you should be drinking regularly throughout the day. You don't want to be drinking so much fluid that you're going to the bathroom every 10-15 minutes, but you should be able to get through a water bottle or two if you're not doing any training, and then you should be increasing this if you are going to training as well. Seeking professional advice regarding supplement use is really important. There may be instances when it may be warranted to consume a particular supplement if you are iron deficient, vitamin D deficient, if you have huge energy requirements and you're really struggling to get that volume of food in. Sports dietitians and sports nutritionists can really provide a lot of valuable advice on how to achieve that on an individual basis. And the very last practical tip is you need to train hard. As I mentioned before, nutrition is one piece of the puzzle. It's really important to get that piece right, but you also need to be doing all the training to achieve your athletic goals. Now, we've compiled a list of resources for you that we hope will be helpful in some reading after this particular talk. You can see there's some national institutes, and there's also some international websites as well that you might find interesting and hopefully find some really valuable information. Thanks very much, Lorraine.